Okay, good evening, everybody. My name's Professor Chris Benowith. I'm the Dean of the Faculty of Arts, Humanities and Business here at the University of Plymouth. And it gives me great pleasure this evening to welcome you here to Annika Bautz's inaugural professorial lecture, Jane Austen and Her Readers, What Makes a Bestseller. So I'm really looking forward to hearing that. So Professor Dafydd Moore will give Annika a more fulsome introduction shortly. I'm just here to go through some of the housekeeping stuff first of all. So if you're online, can you please keep yourself on mute and your video off throughout the lecture? And if you've got any technical issues, email events@plymouth.ac.uk. I'm sure there's somebody waiting there to help you out. Annika's going to be doing a bit of a Q&A at the beginning of her lecture, and then there'll be questions at the end. So in order to do that, if you want to sort of take part in that, use Slido to do that, and the hashtag there, and you can type your questions into the box which comes up. So you might want to get yourself ready for that if you want to be part of the Q&A. Chat function online will be enabled throughout, but we're not going to use that to take questions. That'll be done through the Slido. So if you are interested in engaging in the session here, then please use Slido. If you're in the room, please keep your mobile phones on silent, or any devices on silent. We're not expecting a fire drill this evening, so if the fire alarm does go off, this is the quickest way out through this door here. If you can't make it down to that door, then you can go back out through the door that you came through, and just make your way across the cross point and out through the doors, and basically get as far away from the building as possible. The glass windows tend to explode outwards, so run away. For people not at the university, Smeaton, Scott, Link, they're not going to mean anything, so just get away. And again, lastly, same for the people online. If you want to take part, if you're in the room and you want to take part, then please do use Slido with that code. Okay, without further ado, I will pass over to Professor Dafydd Moore, who will introduce Annika.
Thanks, Chris. And you've come here to... Yeah, Annika would have... You've come here to hear Annika, not hear about Annika, and certainly not hear from me. So I won't detain you for too long, but it gives me very great pleasure to introduce Annika's inaugural lecture. Inaugural lectures are a high point for any institution, a high point in an academic career. Universities can bestow no higher honour than a professorship on its staff. And it's an opportunity for our senior academics to offer an insight into their work. So in Annika's case, the career that this really is an important moment in tonight. A career started at the University of Hamburg, where she took a bachelor's degree in English with history. This included a year spent on a scholarship at the University of Newcastle upon Tyne, where she then went on to complete a PhD in the reception histories of Sir Walter Scott and Jane Austen. And it was, in fact, in Newcastle, at the British Association for Romantic Studies conference in July of 2005, that Annika and my own paths crossed for the first time. I'll put the batteries back in later. And it's a great pleasure then, and a privilege to be introducing her sort of nearly 20 years later from that occasion where I think our eyes met. And she said to me, "Have you come to register?" So since completing her PhD, Annika has worked at the University of Kiel and at the University of Zurich before taking up a lectureship at Plymouth in 2010. And at Plymouth, Annika's research has gone from strength to strength, and I'll be back to that. But she's also been instrumental in leading our institution. Associate Head of School for Education, and latterly Head of School of Humanities and Performing Arts, Law, Criminology and Government, and since September, our new School of Society and Culture. Annika's research focuses on book history, particularly 19th century reception studies. And you'll hear a lot about that this evening, but by way of an amateur introduction, book history is, as we'll see, a distinct branch of literary studies concerned with the material nature of books as they were produced and consumed in the past. It's interested in the book trade, in things like the price of paper, market structures and expectations. In other words, the commercial dimensions to a business that can otherwise be obscured by more familiar approaches to literary texts. And Annika's work has been field-defining in its contribution to rethinking notions of literary popularity and the processes whereby writers become considered great, showing how the reception of authors varies across centuries and cultures in both qualitative but also quantitative terms, as readers bring the concerns of their own times to their interactions with the literary texts, receiving them in new ways, creating new interpretations and derive new meanings. She's the author of 19 articles and chapters and 2 monographs, and she's co-edited 4 collections of essays with more on the way. Now, I'm going to just mention a few of these. I would say I'm not going to mention co-editors in the interest of time, although one is in the room and more may be online, but there are co-editors to those collections of essays, but I'm not going to read all your names out tonight. But of particular reference, I think, to tonight's lectures are her books, A Reader's Guide to the Essential Criticism of Jane Austen's Pride and Prejudice, Emma, and Sense and Sensibility. I think that's a bit of a spoiler. Sorry, I shouldn't have done that. And also The Reception of Jane Austen and Walter Scott, Comparative Longitudinal Study, and collections of essays such as Bicentennial Essays on Jane Austen's Afterlives, Libraries, Books and Collectors of Texts, 1600 to 1900, Judgment and the Victorian Age, Transatlantic Literature and Transitivity, easy for me to say, 1780 to 1850, Subjects, Texts and Print Cultures. And she has a monograph, Victorian Culture, Historical Romance, Material Texts and Edward Willitton, due to come out this year in 2022, and a further collection of essays co-edited entitled Austen After 200, New Reading Spaces. So as you'll see tonight, we're in very good hands when it comes to addressing tonight's topic, Jane Austen and her readers. What makes a bestseller? Professor Annika Bautz.
Thank you, David, for that very kind and generous introduction. It's been a great pleasure and privilege to work with you over all these years. Thank you all for coming, both in person and online. I will say that those in the room are going to be rewarded with canapes and fizz afterwards. So please join us for those when the lecture is drawn to a close. And then lastly, I just want to say a huge thank you to everyone who's helped me get here, who's supported me over the years in a lot of different ways. You know who you are, so thank you. Now, before I start talking about bestsellers and the changing reception of authors, I'd like you all to do a little bit of work for me. It's a very quick quiz that shouldn't take longer than 3 minutes. Could you all get your mobile phones out, please, online and in the room? And type in. The QR code should work, so you can either scan the QR code or you can go to slido.com up there and then enter that code. Okay, I think that's everybody complete. So let's have a quick look at the results. So that looks like a lot of people knew Pride and Prejudice was a novel by Jane Austen. It does also look as if all her other novels feature. So there's Emma, Ivanhoe, maybe not quite, Sense and Sensibility, Mansfield Park, Persuasion. So they're all there, and some additional ones as well. So if we go to Walter Scott, Ivanhoe, lots of people knew that, but after that it gets a little bit Waverley, Rob Roy. So still, there were quite a few people in the audience, clearly, who had some sense of who Walter Scott was and what novels he wrote. And then we get to Willitton. So that's quite a nice one there. So it gets a lot thinner as you go along. So clearly, fewer people had a sense of Willitton's work. Let's have a quick look at this one. So most people knew that Elizabeth Bennet is the heroine of Pride and Prejudice. Let's continue here. 13% of people knew that that Diana Vernon is from Rob Roy. So well done you. Edith Stronach is the heroine of Harold, Last of the Saxon Kings by Edward Bulwer Lytton. Let's have a look. Fergus MacIver is Waverley, is in Waverley, is the Scottish chief in Waverley, but it is a very Scottish name. Last is a Pompey, excellent. And Marianne Dashwood is from Sense and Sensibility. So I think what that's shown generally is that that we're far more familiar with Jane Austen's novels than Scott's or Bulwer's, which of course is what we'd expect in our culture now in the 21st century. I think it's also revealed though that quite a few people are familiar with some of Scott's work at least, or at least have heard of it. Rob Roy and Waverley, and have some sort of Scottish association there. And it's also shown that Edward Bulwer Lytton is, well, perhaps not quite as popular as Austen. So the results, of course, also are skewed because we're in a there are several of my colleagues in the room who hold PhDs in English or a related subject. There are also several people here who've known me quite a long time and have had to listen to Scott and Bulwer tales whether they like to or not. So what it also so really then what we're looking at is at the very opposite of what it would have shown in the 19th century. So if you'd done an equivalence quiz, not on Slido, but if you'd done an equivalence quiz in 1850, it would have shown that everybody knew Bulwer's and Scott's characters, and hardly anybody will have heard of Jane Austen. So we've moved a long way in 200 years in terms of how we regard these authors. Now Scott and Austen were exact contemporaries, and Bulwer lived a bit later. So I'll talk about Scott and Austen first, and I'll start by looking at their popularities in the early 19th century. Oops. So there we go. You want the congratulations one? It'll say David knew it all because he's Professor of English, of course, as you know. He's also had a practice run when we did the tech. So what this shows is that so Jane Austen's first novel was Sense and Sensibility, and it was published in 1811 in a print run of 750 copies. Now to us that sounds very, very little, but that was the sort of average at the time. So most novels at the time were published in print runs of roughly 750 copies. So she's doing okay. It's not exceptional. It's not bad. It's fine. Then her last novel, Persuasion, was published in 1817, 1,750 copies. So she's clearly doing a little bit better. She's become a bit more famous over those years, of which 1,400 were sold within a year. So she's by now doing a little bit better than average. If you compare that to Scott there, Scott's first novel, Waverley, published in 1814, 1,000 copies. So the publisher clearly thought this is going to do a little bit better than average, but wasn't too confident, so published a print run of 1,000 copies. They sold out within 3 weeks. You then have a second edition of 2,000 copies that again sold out within weeks, and then you have 5 further editions before the end of the year. His succeeding novels were even more successful. I've put Rob Roy there as an example because it was published in the same year as Persuasion. So again, in 1817, print run of 10,000 copies and sold out within a fortnight. So that just shows you, in relation to Austen, that just shows you how much of a bestseller he was. Of course, that's also exemplified by their portraits there. The only portrait we have of Jane Austen is that one up there. It was drawn by her sister. I have no idea whether his sister was a good painter or not, but so we don't know whether that's anything like what Jane Austen looked like, but it's the only thing we've got. Don't know if anyone's been to the National Portrait Gallery, as of course I had to as a PhD student to go and see, look at the original. You're looking at all these grand portraits there, and then you're looking at something that's this size, which is the drawing of Jane Austen. Whereas Scott, of course, because he was so popular, was painted by all the best artists of the time. So that's just one example there. So the difference between the reception then and now exemplifies what my research is about. So it's part of a discipline, as David was saying, that we call the history of the book. And what it roughly does is it looks at the history of literature and literate culture, although it does go beyond literate culture very quickly, because literature, of course, goes into culture even if you can't read. So if you're walking through the streets of 19th century London, you'd see the illustrations of characters from Scott's novels in shop windows. You might have gone to an adaptation of a novel at the theatre. So the characters were very quickly permeated culture anyway. So book history also looks at the production, distribution, and reading of books. And it looks at the reception of an author's texts. So how different readerships at different times and places respond to an author's texts. Now, studying the reception of an author helps us think through assumptions, our assumptions of literary canon formation. So who our most important authors are. We all have assumptions about who should be part or who we think our most important authors are. Most of us would put Austen up there. Some of us might put Scott up there. Probably nobody in this room, I'm guessing, will put Willitton up there. And of course, that's very different from the 19th century, when everybody would have put Bulwer up there, everybody would have put Scott up there, and probably hardly anyone, if anyone at all, would have put Austen up there. So what that shows really is that our literary canon is the creation of a particular culture at a particular point in time. And of course, that also goes for the way in which we read. So our horizon of expectations, so the fact that readers read as part of a time, a place, a society, a culture, and that influences or determines their expectations and therefore their interpretations. So therefore, a text receptions. So texts aren't some static entity that somehow the reader's task is to reveal the true meaning that this text that somehow it is the task of the reader to reveal, but instead the meaning is created by the interaction between text and reader. So looking at the reception of an author over centuries then tells us about the receiving culture in the past, but also our own. So that's roughly what I've spent the last 15 years of my life on. So today I'll give you a few examples of book historical study. I'll start with Walter Scott and look at print run sales and spin-offs there. Then I'll look at Jane. Then we'll move on to Jane Austen, and I'll look at different measures of popularity. So I'll look at reviews, print runs, and illustrations. Then we'll move on to Edward Bulwer-Lytton, look at print runs and book illustrations, and then I'll bring it back to a local level and talk about the Plymouth Proprietary Library and their holdings. So when he published his first novel, Waverley, then in 1814, Scott was already a highly celebrated poet. So Waverley is a historical novel. The subtitle is "'Tis 60 Years Since." It's about the 1745 Jacobite rising led by Charles Edward Stuart, so Bonnie Prince Charlie. It was immediately successful, and here's what Austen said when it was first published. Walter Scott has no business to write novels, especially good ones. It is not fair. He has fame and profit enough as a poet and should not be taking the bread out of other people's mouths. I do not like him, and I do not mean to like Waverley if I can help it, but fear I must. It's a kind of classic Austen reaction, I think. Because Austen wasn't alone in liking the novel, Waverley's success was immediate and unprecedented. So it brought author and publishers profits previously unseen in the publishing world, and that only became greater as he published more novels. So in Scott's lifetime, as I've said above, an average print run for a novel was between 500 and 1,000 copies. Scott's novels had print runs of 10,000 and above. And by the middle of the 19th century, Scott's works had sold more than 2 million copies, which is 1 million more than all other Romantic period authors put together. So whether you take Mary Shelley, Keats, Blake, whoever you want, you put all of them together, and Scott is still selling more than double. So he's by far the most famous living novelist of his time. He was regarded as the equal of Homer and Shakespeare. His influence was far beyond his lifetime. There are countless paintings, adaptations, operas, illustrations, stories, etc. And here's a few examples. So librettos of over 90 operas are based on his work. More plays have been adapted from his works than any other. And after the Duke of Wellington, he was the most frequently paid in person in the early 19th century. So there are 233 recorded representations, which is quite something. I'll show you a couple of them. So this one's the one I showed above. So this is the Rayburn portrait, and here's another one by Edwin Landseer. So again, the most famous artists of the day would go and paint Scott because he was superlatively popular. So I'll compare that now to how Jane Austen was read, so that we can start to understand why perhaps she was not very popular in the early 19th century. And I'll start by looking at the book covers, because of course a book cover influences how you read. It still does. When you go to a bookshop, the book cover does have a material influence on how you judge a book. And so one of the factors that influences how you read a text is how it's packaged. So I'll talk you through the title pages of Austen's and Scott's first novel. So Sense and Sensibility there and Waverley both are published anonymously. Neither of them give you the author, but it's a very different anonymity. So if you look at that there, the subtitle for Sense and Sensibility says a novel. Now novels in the early 19th century were not very highly regarded at all. They were not seen as intellectually stimulating, as worthy, as educational. They were not useful reading. They were basically the equivalent of soap operas. They were something to pass the time with, but they weren't seen as useful. That also meant that they were associated with female authors and female readers. So because they weren't seen as intellectually demanding, I suppose. Waverley, of course, very, very cleverly there has as a subtitle to 60 Years Since, so that puts it into a historical category. And of course, history was regarded as much more useful than novels. And of course, Scott has been credited with inventing the historical novel. He didn't invent it, but he did popularize it. Then on for Sense and Sensibilities it goes on to say by a lady. Now on the one hand that gives you the class, so it puts it very, very clearly in a middle class category or upper class category, but it also genders it in all the ways that you might expect. So this is a novel written by a woman, presumably for women. Whereas on Scott's title page there, he puts a Shakespeare quote in. You can there's a quote from Henry IV there. So again, he's sort of trying to associate himself with something that is not a novel, but regarded unequivocally as much higher. And lastly, then for Austen on the title page there, you get printed for the author. Printed for the author basically means it's vanity publishing. So she paid a publisher to print this novel, and the publisher would get a commission if the novel was a success. So the commission happened to be 10%. The novel did sell well, and there was a profit, so the publisher got 10% of that profit. Had it made a loss, the risk would have been entirely the author's. So it's like vanity publishing now. Basically, it means the publisher didn't have enough confidence in the novel to buy the copyright. Whereas for Scott, you get printed by Ballantyne for Constable. Constable was a well-known publisher at the time, so what immediately that sort of signals that somebody did have enough confidence in the novel to buy the copyright. Although Scott was smart enough to only sell half of his copyright, so he did make a profit when Waverley was far more successful than anyone had thought it would be. So what this shows then is that both novels enter the market anonymously, but it's a very different anonymity. I'll move on now to show you some contemporary readings of Austen, and I'll start again with a quote by Henry Austen, who's Austen's brother, that again goes to show that how important gender was to her reception. When Pride and Prejudice made its appearance, a gentleman celebrated for his literary attainments advised a friend of the authoress to read it, adding with more point than gallantry, "I should like to know who's the author, for it is much too clever to have been written by a woman." And similarly, John Moritz, a friend of Scott's, writes to Scott on the appearance of Waverley and says, "Amongst the gentle class of readers, so women, who swallow every novel for the sake of the story, I should fear that half the knowledge of nature Waverley contains and all the humour would be thrown away." So just, again, to emphasise the contemporary assumptions about novels, which clearly the assumption here is that anything clever isn't suitable, can't have been written by a woman, and also can't be suitable for women. That theme of gender does go through the reception in the early 19th century throughout. So I'll show you here another part of the review where the reviewer says that Austen never dips her pen in satire. The follies which she holds up are mere follies, and she treats them as such with good-humoured pleasantry, mimicking them so exactly that we always laugh at the ridiculous truth of the imitation, but without ever being incited to indulge in feelings that might render us ill-natured or intolerant in society. Now, today, of course, some of the words that come to mind when we think of Austen are irony, satire, and so we do think of her as criticizing her society. Whereas, of course, this is a view of her novels that is much more ladylike, that makes it okay. It's suitable for women. Another thing that we tend to associate with Austen is, of course, her realism. So the descriptions of the society around her. And this is how contemporaries reacted. In imagination of all kinds, she appears to have been extremely deficient. Not only her stories are utterly and entirely devoid of invention, but her characters, her incidents, her sentiments are obviously all drawn exclusively from experience. So what we like about it is that it is showing us the everyday. And what readers clearly wanted was something loftier, something higher, something I suppose more dignified, not the vulgar quotidian of everyday life. And the last point I want to make about early 19th century readings is that because novels weren't being seen as useful in an intellectual sense, they were expected to have a moral lesson. So you were supposed to learn something from them. And here's the lesson that I'm sure we all learned from encountering Pride and Prejudice. An excellent lesson may be learned from the elopement of Lydia. The work also shows the folly of letting young girls have their own way and the danger which they incur in associating with the officers who may be quartered in or near their residence. So I'm sure that's the lesson we all took away from reading the novel. So overall, then, what these quotations show, I hope, is that she was being read, but she was not a bestseller. There is nothing in here that makes her in any way exceptional. She's not very highly regarded. There's certainly nothing in here that will make you think that 200 years later she's regarded as one of the biggest authors of all time. So what I'll do now is I'll move to have a little look at editions of Pride and Prejudice throughout the 19th century, and then see it, and then look at how she was read towards the end of the century. So the recorded reaction that we have, whether that's reviews or whether that's comments in diaries or letters, are of course all heavily skewed towards the rich, right? These comments are written by middle-class writers and for middle-class readers. Access to novels generally in the 19th century was of course restricted by price. I'll give Austen as an example here, but the pattern holds for novels in the 19th century generally. So as you can see there, the first edition published in 1813 for 18 shillings. As it goes through the century, editions become cheaper and cheaper. Now that pattern is the same as today. You get a hardback that comes out, and after a while you can buy it in paperback, obviously much cheaper. But for us, that takes months, and in the 19th century, it always took years, mostly decades. So this is Austen, but actually the pattern holds for all three-decker Victorian novels that we can think of. So in some ways then, what book history does, I suppose, it suggests that we need to revise our assumptions of when a novel hit the market, because when it hits the market in a first edition, it's too expensive for most people to be able to buy it. So really then what I'm interested in here are the last two editions here, the sixpenny editions, because that is the edition that finally is making Austen accessible to a working class readership. So it took decades to get there. I put some earnings there just to sort of put that in relation. If you're, say, on a wage of 30 shillings a week, you're not going to spend 18 of that on a novel. So Routledge and Dix then are the first publishers to make the novel available in a sixpenny edition, and the Routledge archives, which are extant. The Dix archives don't exist anymore, but the Routledge archives do exist, and they confirm, as we might expect, that the print runs of sixpenny editions are higher than those of the more expensive editions. So it's a different model, isn't it? You publish more, you publish higher print runs of the edition you're going to sell more cheaply. Now, it's a very simple statement. It does take hours and hours and hours of trying to decipher Victorian handwriting. So, so that is what you get when you do that, though. It just shows what we expect, which is that the highest print run is for the cheapest edition. So if you compare those, though, to the 750 copies of the first edition of Sense and Sensibility, though, it does put in perspective when a mass readership starts to have access to Austen's novels. Now, these editions were literally read to bits. There are very few that survive because they owed a lot to newspaper technology. So they were on very thin paper. They were printed in double column, tiny print. They were very difficult to read, but there were lots of readers for each copy. So they were not copies that you would buy to display in your living room. They were not status symbols. So they weren't beautiful. They were literally there to be read. It does mean that these sixpenny editions shaped more readings than any other editions. So the more expensive the more expensive editions tend to be the ones that people focus on because they tend to be more interesting in terms of, say, the illustrations, or in terms of the binding, or in terms of just looking beautiful. But it's the sixpenny editions that shaped more readings than any others. So what I'll do is I'll have a quick look at two illustrations in one of them, just to give you an idea of how Austen was read by the end of the 19th century. So this is, for those of you who know Pride and Prejudice, this is in chapter 18, so the Netherfield Ball. Netherfield Ball is the first time that Elizabeth and Mr. Darcy talk for any length of time. It tends to be what we focus on because it shows Elizabeth independence and spunk, I suppose. But this scene here focuses on Elizabeth and Mr. Collins. Now, most of us don't even remember that scene, of course. So she was teased by Mr. Collins, who continued most perseveringly by her side, and though he could not prevail with her to dance with him again, put it out of her power to dance with others. So the scene shows her at Mr. Collins' mercy. All she can do is deny him another dance. So that's, of course, the only female prerogative, that of saying no. But she can't take initiative, she can't get away, she can't talk to anyone, she can't dance. So the image focuses on her enforced passivity rather than on any spirited activity. And the idea is underlined by there being no other people around them, so all you can see there is Mr. Collins and Elizabeth. Her eyes are downcast. In the novel, it makes a point about her eyes. Her head is downcast. There's no hint of defiance here. So she doesn't look as if she's about to disobey her mother or refuse Mr. Collins' proposal of marriage, which is, of course, what she goes on to do in the next chapter. Mr. Collins standing up here gives him dignity. It underlines that as a man in this social situation, he has the upper hand. So the scene chosen for illustration here shows Elizabeth to be conforming to conservative ideals of female behavior rather than exhibiting any kind of independence or going against official conventions. I'll give you one more example. This is right at the end of the novel. When her mother went to her dressing room at night, she followed her. So this shows her in a scene that 21st century readers tend to forget, partly because it's not given much space in the novel. It's the act of telling her mother about her engagement to Darcy. So her posture here, her hands together, downcast eyes, depict a demure girl who's dutiful towards her mother and is asking for her mother's blessing. Now in the novel, it's of course her father who she really talks to, because it's her father who she has a connection to. Her father needs to understand her choice because he's concerned that she marries primarily for love, not money. And it's the conversation between Elizabeth and her father that the central part of the chapter is taken up with. And I'll just give you that reaction here. Mr. Darcy's rich, to be sure, and you may have more fine clothes and carriages than Jane, but will they make you happy? I've given him my consent. He's the kind of man indeed to whom I should never dare refuse anything which he condescended to ask. And now give it to you if you're resolved on having him. But let me advise you to think better of it. I know your disposition, Lizzie. I know that you could be neither happy nor respectable unless you truly esteemed your husband, unless you looked up to him as a superior. Your lively talents will place you in the greatest danger in an unequal marriage. You could scarcely escape discredit and misery. My child, let me not have the grief of seeing you unable to respect your partner in life. So the most important thing for her father is her happiness, whereas her mother's reaction is characteristically money-focused. And I've highlighted the money bits in yellow for you there. So that's Mrs. Bennet. Good gracious, Lord bless me, only think, dear me, Mr. Darcy, who'd have thought it? And is it really true? Oh, my sweetest Lizzie, how rich and how great you'll be. What pin money, what jewels, what carriages you'll have. James is nothing to it, nothing at all. I'm so pleased, so happy, such a charming man, so handsome, so tall. Oh, my dear Lizzie, pray apologise for my having disliked him so much before. I hope he will overlook it. Dear, dear Lizzie, a house in town, everything that is charming. 3 daughters married, 10,000 a year. Oh, Lord, what will become of me? I shall go distracted. This was enough to prove that her approbation need not be doubted, and Elizabeth, rejoicing that such an effusion was heard only by herself, soon went away. But before she'd been 3 minutes in her own room, her mother followed her. My dearest child, she cried, I can think of nothing else. 10,000 a year and very likely more. 'Tis as good as a lord. But my dearest love, tell me what dish Mr. Darcy is particularly fond of, that I may have it tomorrow. So that is the maternal blessing that this illustration is meant to illustrate. So there's no indication in the text of the obvious humour, in the image of the obvious humour in the text, and the illustration, of course, also ignores her mother's judgment of her Elizabeth's judgment of her mother's reaction. So it's in keeping with the character of Elizabeth that the edition has portrayed so far. Just as she's Mr. Collins' captive, she also obediently listens to whatever her mother says. And no matter how ridiculous her mother is, she still needs her blessing. So that image turns Mrs. Bennet into a respectable Victorian matriarch and makes Elizabeth a model of filial obedience. So as well as presenting a working class readership with conservative ideas of femininity, then the edition also advocates strict family hierarchy. Now, the challenges to traditional gender roles that came in the late 19th century, so feminist campaigning, new ideas about women's roles, availability of divorce and contraception, that did slowly change, but increasingly change women's lifestyle choices. But in the late 19th century, these movements were largely confined to middle and upper class women. So this edition, aimed at a working class audience, reinforces ideas of filial obedience and proper feminine behavior. Now, in recent years, of course, in the 21st century, the tendency has been to emphasize feminine agency and Elizabeth's resistance to social conventions so that she connects to 21st century ideas of femininity. And there's one nice example there. So there she is as an action heroine. And here's some more examples. There are countless examples of this, of course. So if you just look at that example in the middle there, obstinate, headstrong girl, that's what Lady Catherine says to Elizabeth, and that's clearly how people now want to see their daughters. Then Jane Austen, the secret radical, again, is how we want to see her as pushing boundaries. And then the one on the right I just put there because it's one of the many spin-offs that's got nothing to do with the novel really, other than using the title in there for connoting or trying to associate feminism, or at least female concerns. So what the Pride and Prejudice example overall has shown then is that the same novel is read very differently over 200 years. So in the early 19th century, there's that focus on the moral lesson. In the late 19th century, you have conservative Victorian values, especially regarding gender, and then by the 21st century, you're moving it to feminine agency and feminism. So Austen has gone from not being very well known at all to being one of the best known and most admired novelists. By contrast, Edward Bulwer Lytton, who I'll talk about now, there he is. As we saw on the Slido, and generally in the 21st century, we're not very familiar with him at all. But in the 19th century, absolutely everybody would have known him and have been very familiar with his characters. So he was immensely successful throughout the 19th century and outsold Dickens. Now, Bulwer's popularity also meant huge influence. So he helped perpetuate and create stories and myths that are with us now. So understanding his 19th century reception also helps us understand the source of some of our stories and beliefs. I'll focus on one particular novel. I'll focus on the last days of Pompey. So it was published in 1834, and It was immensely successful in the UK and internationally. I've put two examples there. On the left, there is the first Italian edition of 1835 that was immediately sold on the site. So you could travel to Pompey and you could buy the novel and you could walk around the ruins and imagine where Julia's house or Ione's house or whatever other character from the novel you might want to imagine lived. In fact, the edition was printed so that you could divide it into parts, so you didn't have to log the whole novel around with you. You could just take a part and go and see where particular characters might have lived. The one on the right there is just an example of how popular it was. So hotels would print editions and put them in hotel rooms for their guests to be entertained, I guess like a television now or something. And of course, you chose a novel that you know people would have liked, not some obscure author they never heard of. So you wouldn't choose that now. So Pompey was discovered in 1749 and of course has fascinated people ever since. And Willitton was one of many to tap into that fascination. So The Last Days of Pompey became a long-standing bestseller, which created and consolidated stereotypes and myths about Romans in Pompey, many of which, of course, survive until this day. So just if you think about decadent Romans in Pompey, or virtuous Christians in Pompey, or lion-fighting gladiators. So it was immediately popular, and I'll show you here the print run. So this is a very similar pattern to Austen. I've cut out lots of editions, but the trend is the same. So first edition comes out in a print run of 1,000 copies, 31 shillings 6p is the standard price for Victorian novels. You then move to cheaper editions, and as you can see, the cheaper the editions, the higher the print run becomes. Now, because Ball was so popular, there were also immediately spin-offs in the theatre, and songs, opera, pantomime, circus, book illustrations, and so on. So there were lots of other ways in which you could become familiar with the novel. Here's there we go. There's just a playbill from one of the many adaptations of the novel, because of course theatre tickets could be purchased for 6p, and if you went at half time, it was only halfpenny. So it's much cheaper than the book. And it didn't require literacy. So lots of people found out about The Last Days of Pompey and the characters in it through theatre. Also, it featured the eruption of a volcano. I mean, I think that was quite a draw as well. So it's beyond literate culture. So there were play adaptations within weeks and continue to be throughout the 19th century. So it was a hugely popular novel that made it to all levels of society through various different means. What I'll do now is I'll focus on book illustrations just to show you some of the ways in which the novel was read. I'll focus on 2 points here. On the one hand, on Roman depravity, decadence, and violence, and on the other, on inserting Christians. So the story argues that Vesuvius erupting was a punishment by a Christian god for a vain, decadent, and violent Roman society. So that's the premise, and that is, of course, reflected in the illustrations that do show Romans as vain, lazy, really just busy, going from orgy to orgy. So these are people that had it coming and were justly punished when Vesuvius erupted. So here are some of the illustrations. Clearly she's got nothing to do other than admire herself there, so quite vain. This one I quite like because it's refashioning Julia, one of the characters in the novel, one of the Roman characters in the novel, as Snow White's evil stepmother, who, of course, as we all know, has to die at the end of the fairy tale, just as Julia dies at the end of the novel. I mean, in fact, most characters die because Vesuvius erupts. And here's some orgies, clearly totally immoral and not a society that could be endorsed. So here's some of the images about that depict violence. Now, Vesuvius erupts as the games in the amphitheater are taking place, and you can see the crowds in the background there. This is obviously a society that had to be punished for their sins because they're enjoying violence and because they're cruel. So this is one of the myths that really survived through to us. I think the idea, it's one of the enduring legacies of the novel. Now, of course, As an aside, there won't have been any games in 79 AD. The city had been destroyed by a major earthquake in 69 AD. All games were disallowed after that because public and private funds were needed to rebuild the city. But of course, it's a very, very effective staging. It's much better to have Vesuvius erupt while you have games on in the amphitheatre. You could argue that the masterstroke actually was to insert Christians. So Bulwer does two things here. On the one hand, he argues that there were Christians in Pompey, that there hasn't been, and there wasn't then, and there still isn't any evidence that there were Christians in Pompey. But Bulwer's novel popularized that idea. So that's one point, and the other is the point I've mentioned, so that a Christian god punished the city for its sins, but obviously saved the Christians. So Bulwer takes characters from the Bible and then invents a connection to the invented characters at Pompey. So one biblical connection he draws is inserting Paul. So that's Paul there. He can't quite get Paul to Pompey. So he has one of the people, he has the hero talk about his fathers having seen Paul speak in Athens. So it highlights early Christianity, and it forges a link between the Bible and characters in the novel. And then the second example is an old man who comes to Pompey, but is not just some old man. He's a character that Bulwer has again taken from the Bible. This is the widow's son at Nain, who's miraculously raised from the dead by Christ in Luke 7:11-17. So he comes to Pompey as a very old man, just about possible in 79 AD, and blesses the congregation there. As you can see, this is an American version, so a Protestant version, and here's a Southern German Catholic version. It's the same scene, but you can see he's elevated like a pope, so he blesses his inferiors there. So both scenes emphasize Christianity and the biblical connection, but then the differences between the receiving cultures, I think, are also evident. So Christianity versus Roman decadence was a big part of how the novel was received. I'll just make one more point about the novel, which is this: when Glaucus, the hero, is later wrongfully, of course, accused of murder and put into the arena, the lion does not touch a man with such Christian and heroic sentiments. So here's the lion who's meant to be eating Glaucus, but clearly isn't interested, because he won't eat people who are Christian. Same scene there, same scene there. So most editions in the 19th century that have any illustrations of the novel always show the lion who won't eat Christians. And before the nasty Pompeians can think of another way of killing Glaucus, Vesuvius erupts and kills everybody else apart from Glaucus. So many of these myths, of course, survive to the 20th and 21st centuries. This one might show you some of those. So you can see the decadence there, the violence, the punishment. Of course, Christians play a major part in the film. You can read the caption there: "The city that lived in sin and died in flame." So again, that idea that this city was punished by God for its sins. So that poster, I think, does nicely exemplify how the myths are being carried on to that 1959 film and beyond. So that was my third example of looking at the reception of an author over time. So Scott, Austen, and Bulwer. And I'll wrap the talk up by looking at a fourth example that combines the three above and brings them to Plymouth. The history of reading is, of course, bound up with the history of libraries, because that's how a lot of people got access to reading. And here's Plymouth Public Library. So in 19th century Plymouth, then, what was read, who had access to which texts? And that led to a book on libraries with James Gregory, who's up there, who wrote a few years ago, edited. So Plymouth Public Library was founded in 1810 in what was then the important maritime town of Plymouth in Devon. As many of you know, of course, the library is still very much alive and in existence, and it's great to see lots of current library members up there. Thank you for coming. So Plymouth in the Napoleonic Wars had a very strategic position, and that is how the town grew in wealth and population. The library, as you can see there, was housed in a magnificent purpose-built building. The proprietors commissioned Folkestone, who was then London-based, to be the architect. It was the region's preeminent library for most of the 19th century. Now, public throughout the century, of course, did not denote free at the point of use. That's our understanding of a public library, but that didn't come in until the end of the until after the 1850s Act, and took until really the 1880s to be established. So public in 1810 just meant not the library of a private individual. So it didn't belong to the Parkers of Saltram House, say, or to Lanhydrock or whatever. So 1810 is, of course, many decades before any state-funded libraries existed. So by 1880, though, you did have the first public as in free at the point of use library in Plymouth, and that is when what had until then been Plymouth Public Library decided to change its name to Plymouth Proprietary Library, which of course is what it's still called today. So this is a library that's funded by private individuals, not by public funds, and the aim is the acquisition of knowledge, not entertainment. So the holdings, therefore, are focused not on entertainment or novels, but on what is seen as more educational, more useful genres. So at a time when the status of novels was low, many prestigious libraries didn't hold novels at all, whereas Plymouth Public Library did hold novels from the off. Now the catalogues are luckily still extant, so we have a good idea of what the library held over the decades. And Plymouth did include novels from the off, and novels in 1824 accounted for about 3% of the holdings. So most of the focus was on travel literature, history, biography, and so on. Here are three more. You can probably make that out there. So one thing to point out about the 1824 catalogue there is just how important the rules are and how important the laws are. So this is they're proud of having founded their institution, and they need to make sure that people understand how to use it. So it's all about status really there. For the 1835 and 1843 catalogues, you can see how novels are one unimportant category under item 11 there. In no catalogue throughout the 19th century do novels account for more than 3.5% of the holdings. So there aren't many novels at all. The novels that there are the ones that are being regarded as contributing to general education. So some superior novels are included, and in all catalogues throughout the 19th century, they include the novels of Walter Scott, and of course they include the novels of Edward Bulwer Lytton, all of them. None of the catalogues of the 19th century include anything by Jane Austen. So that very nicely brings us back to the beginning of the talk. So whereas now, of course, Austen would always make it onto general education lists and library holdings. Scott sometimes, and Bulwer never. That was obviously very, very different in the throughout the 19th century. So readers' culture and values have changed and led to very different readings and of texts over centuries. Thank you.
Well, now the really exciting bit. Time for questions. And we've got a few questions come in via Slido. Those of you in the room might not want to type away, so we'll take some in the room as well. But I'll start with a question on Slido, since I've managed to open the iPad.
Which I
was a bit worried about whether I was going to get the iPad. But anyway, this is a question about, if we think about today, and thinking about what we know about these authors, what kind of social and cultural factors do you think might impact on the potential of a novel today to be a bestseller?
That's a very interesting question. So one of the things that I think led to Austen's rise in popularity was feminism. So you can track it throughout the 20th century, and when feminism, the sort of 1870s onwards, that's really when Jane Austen's popularity goes up. So as soon as feminism hits and her novels can be read in a way that speaks particularly to women's independence and women's concerns, that's when Austen's popularity goes up. I don't know whether you can generalize on that, and I suppose I'd rather not, but certainly for Austen that was a major factor.
Question at the front.
Noticing my last time I went around the Tatings on Irons, I noticed the number of matching with your theme of the last days of Pompey. I saw there are endless paintings which really used Christians being thrown to lions as excuse material to show semi-naked women. Have we sort of got the same sort of thing going on there? But that you can use, effectively it's by saying it's just about everyday life, you can sort of, it's excuse material to say it's not interesting, whereas something historical like Rob Roy and studying what was really a pile of yarn as somehow historical importance.
So for the benefit of people joining us online, the question is about whether showing people being thrown to lions and other things was just a way of salaciously putting semi-clad ladies into novels, whereas other more worthy subject matter might be less available.
It might well have been. I mean, I'm sure that one of the reasons I think The Last Days of Pompey was so popular in the 19th century was Vesuvius. There were countless theatre adaptations for it, and the main thing in the 19th century there were only 2 theatres that were allowed to show dialogue or drama. All the others weren't allowed to show the spoken word. So of course, something that was a spectacle was fantastic, because you could have explosions, you could have people die. It was great. So I'm sure that was one of the reasons why the theatres immediately thought this was a good thing to put on.
Another question from Slido. Don't be shy, so you've been talking about a lot of things that are very sort of historically specific about writing, but do you think that there are features of writing that sort of transcend culture and genre?
So I suppose the argument for that would be something like Shakespeare's been popular for many centuries now, and it doesn't look as if any of us think that the way he's regarded is ever going to die out anytime soon. But then I wouldn't like to make predictions like that, because you never know what the next 100 or 200 years might bring. I'm sure people 200 years ago didn't ever predict, or even 100 years wouldn't ever have predicted that people nowadays wouldn't know who Edward Bulwer Lytton was. Like, somebody outsold Dickens and everybody knew, that was just not part of what people could imagine, just as we can't imagine that anybody would ever not like Jane Austen.
Jeremy.
There's something you touched upon earlier in your presentation, which is that perceptions of Austen were that she was very realistic and not inventive. And is that somehow the attractiveness of her perception now, is that she provides a realistic lens on the past, which is for us more interesting. Moreover, is it a lens on the past which we now agree with? Culture has moved on. Is that because of her popularity? She offers a realistic but also a culturally contemporary view of the past that we feel particularly attractive.
So the question is about whether all those things that contemporary or Austen's contemporary reviewers didn't like about it, being lacking in imagination, was precisely what has interested readers from the late 19th century onwards.
I think you're right. I'm sure that is part of what we like about it, is the realistic depiction of everyday life, because it gives us an idea of the early 9th century. And I think feminism provides us with a lens of reading it of seeing that critically, right? So we see most of her heroines as pushing boundaries. We kind of and so that of course accords, as you say, with how we want to see the world and what we think is right. Or what we tend to value. So I think you're absolutely right. I think that is exactly one of the things, and the other way around as well. So what reviewers of Austen there showed us that they wanted characters to be more lofty, to be more I suppose unrealistic, to be more heroic, and I think Scott gave them that. He gave them a much bigger scope with much more heroic characters, but that also was given in a style that took 3 pages just to get to the end of a sentence, and that's just not something that 21st century readers can stomach. It's too long and too unrealistic, I guess.
She's often just writing for the wrong century. Is that her problem?
in some ways, yes, probably, yes. I mean, I think a lot of what makes her popular now is that she does write dialogue that's very easily digestible. It's very quick. It's very witty. The attention span for us is Twitter, isn't it? So it's much more like that. Yeah.
A sort of follow on Slido really is, can we date perhaps to a decade, perhaps? I'll give you a decade, when Austen's book sales began to overtake Scott and
First World War. Yeah.
First World War.
Yeah, so it coincides pretty much precisely with the First World War. So when I suppose there was a when she became, in some people's words, England's Jane. So when you could sort of see it as a golden age. So prior to feminism, prior to seeing the early 19th century as being criticized in the novels, you could see it as a kind of culture that was untouched by war. Obviously, that's since been disputed by lots of critics, because of course her novels are very much part of their cultural context. But in the early 20th century, she was often read as someone who you could read to find peace. Shell-shocked soldiers were given Austen to comfort them, because it was seen as not stirring your emotions and not kind of as calming you down, I guess. And then after that is sort of when Scott's popularity starts to go down.
Third row.
Hiya.
So the question was whether we think, or Annika thinks, we will I don't care what you think. Whether we'll tire of Austen, or whether there'll always and constantly be different ways of reading it.
So at the moment, it certainly doesn't look as if anybody is tiring of her. What I think is going down is readings of her novel. What's not going down at all is adaptations and various ways of engaging with her and her characters. So there's so many. There's so many different media in which you can engage with her, so many different spin-offs, and I think the things she's associated with are what will continue to be popular. How much of that is still based on her novel, I can't even say. Like, we could probably ask the audience here, how many of you that knew that Elizabeth featured in Pride and Prejudice knew that because you'd read the novel, and how many of you knew that because you'd never touched the novel, but because it's just cultural knowledge and you might have seen a film, or you might have read a book cover, or whatever.
So picking that up, actually, a question from Slido. Speculate. How do you think people who weren't literate, or at least not literate enough to read these novels, might have experienced shows based on Pompey or Scott novels? What would they have taken from it?
So I suppose that depends on which adaptation they would have seen. So there were lots of adaptations of Scott and Bulwer's novels. And they did vary quite a bit. Because they were both very, very highly regarded, there were also plays that were put on in Covent Garden or Drury Lane, and they were the two only theatres in the country that were allowed to put on the spoken word. So you would get a dramatic version of more or less the novel. But of course, it was still not the novel, but the main ingredients, the characters, the volcano, whatever would have been in there. And then dependent on how much money you had. So the cheapest tickets to the theatre were sixpence. That was in the gallery. You had very, very obstructed views, just about make out the story. But if the version you saw wasn't even a drama, if it was spectacle, say, you'd have probably taken up the main ingredients, say the non-Christian eating lion, but I don't know how many other ingredients you would have taken away. And again, it does depend on money, because of course, if you had more money, then you might have taken a box, you might have seen various different adaptations, and you might also have read the novel. And yourself, if you've read a novel and you then go and see a film or a play, you will see it very differently to if you haven't read the novel first.
Gregory.
Yes. Do you consider the much greater length of Scott's novels is something which is putting off the modern reader?
So the question is whether the length, the formidable length of Scott's novels is why no one bothers to read them anymore.
Yes, most definitely. I think it's partly the length. I think it's also partly the writing style. So so for Scott, absolutely. I think some of the sentences are just for us take a little bit too long to get into, if that makes sense. And for Bulwer, certainly. I mean, there's the Bulwer-Lytton bad fiction contest because his writing is regarded as unreadable now. It's not absolutely unreadable, actually. I've done it, but it's I can see where they're coming from.
So I'm going to go back to Slido, and then we'll come back to the room. I'm losing track of who's next, but I suspect it's not you, John. But anyway, so obviously one of the reasons why people were worried about women reading in particular was that people would be influenced by what they read. So is there any evidence that once people started reading Pride and Prejudice and women started reading Pride and Prejudice, their behavior and attitudes were changed so not just people thought different things about women and therefore they read Pride and Prejudice, but the reading of Pride and Prejudice changed people's behavior?
Very good question. So in the early 19th century and throughout the 19th century, I'd say there isn't enough evidence to suggest anything like that. But we do have contemporary comments, but they tend to, and reviews, but they tend to not give you that much information. They might talk a little bit about how they regarded the novel, but they very rarely then go on. I don't know enough about the people writing the comments, I guess, to know whether they thought differently after they read the novel to before. And in so I guess I'd need to know more about the people reading it and how that might have affected them.
So I think there was a hand up. Yeah, gentleman next to Anthony.
Yeah, so kind of going back a little bit.
Jamie.
With Austen, is there like an international topography feeding into this golden age of that kind of?
So the question is about the international dimension to Austen being representative of kind of a golden age of Georgian England.
So she is now absolutely internationally popular, especially in America and the UK, but actually has been translated all over the place now, and I would say most Western cultures definitely, and beyond that, know about her. I think it's less from the bits I've read, I think it's less about a golden England now and more about England in the early 19th century and critical takes on that. Yeah.
So a question from Slido, which follows up on that last comment a little bit, almost as if you'd read it, is generally speaking, there's a lot of very wealthy people in Jane Austen novels.
Yeah.
The question is whether that wealth, or rather the source of that wealth, Austen's weakness, which may be a question of where they might go out of fashion, I suppose.
So whether it's a weakness that it doesn't feature the working classes, is that?
Or where the source of that wealth might be assumed from early 19th century. Slavery, in other words.
Yes. I don't know. I don't know if that will have an impact. I think it's certainly something that's being picked up critically. I think it's something that people are very much more aware of. I don't think it makes something unpopular if it features characters whose income relies on slavery, because that's not like Austen doesn't necessarily endorse that, right? She writes about characters. So I mean, Sir Thomas Bertram isn't a very positive character. So I suppose his income deriving from slavery is of course one of the facts in the novel that we now are very conscious of, and that we'll always draw out and discuss. I'm not sure that that's going to make her less popular, because I think you can read it either way. There's no clear statement in that novel, or just as there isn't, I suppose, a very clear statement in Pride and Prejudice about views on the war. Yes, the war's happening, and it informs everything that is happening in the novel. But I don't think there's any argument that you can make that she comes down one side rather than the other that couldn't be down on one side that couldn't be disputed.
Gentleman next to Catherine.
One of these slides you showed called Secret Radical. At the time she was writing, who you legislators and politics use male names. Do you think that had any, fact she didn't use it and said it was written by a lady, do you think that had any effect on her initial sales?
So the question is about the fact that although she didn't name herself by name, she named herself as a lady at a time when right into the middle of the 19th century, women would write under male pen names, and whether that had an impact on her popularity, but also perhaps was a sign of that radicalism that we see nowadays.
So I think it almost certainly had an effect of how her novels were read. But then the assumption in the early 19th century was that women were very much written by and for women anyway. So in some ways, she sort of conforms to that stereotype at the time, if you like. You could argue that it's quite brave. I'd have to know that it was her that put by a lady on the title page. I don't know that. It might have been her publisher that thought it would sell better because of that, because it might have appealed more to a female clientele. So the argument to bring that back to her as a radical, I think, is probably a step too far. But I think you're absolutely right that that having a gendered title page was not that common. Anonymity was very common. So most novels in the early 19th century were published anonymously, but most of them weren't gendered.
One more on Slido. We talked about gender. You've talked about gender. Do you think modern literature and the genres of modern literature continue to be so heavily gendered as they would have been in the late 18th, early 19th century?
I think they are still gendered, yes. Whether more or less, I don't know. But I do think that still plays a huge part in how people read and what they read. I mean, we all know examples of whatever, let's say J.K. Rowling, who was told by a publisher she couldn't put Joanne on the title page. It had to be J.K. because otherwise boys wouldn't pick it up. So of course, there's always a gendered element to how people publish and read, I think.
Gentleman at the front.
I was interested in your lecture, wonderful, by the way.
Thank you.
By the fact that the novels that were esteemed highly by critics and that were included in these public libraries that only included, the most educational novels, were also the ones that were given this kind of showmanship and really brought out to the masses, and the ones that were sold en masse in these very these small, very cheap copies to working class people. Whereas now we see perhaps if you look at the film industry, you see the films that are most critically esteemed aren't necessarily the ones that are most widely watched, whereas you have Marvel films and you have superhero movies and chick flicks and stuff that don't make it to these critical circles. So I was wondering what you thought the origin of that shift might be.
Oh, sorry.
I'm going to try and paraphrase that.
It's a very good question.
So, well, Annika thinks about the answer. So this is about the relationship between popularity and mass spectacle, fundamentally, isn't it? And a
critical reverence.
Yeah. So things that were considered critically important at the time, but were also then the subject of mass consumption in theatre adaptations. And the speculation about how that plays out today, where you don't seem to see quite a clear read-through between mass popularity and critical acclaim.
I think it's a really, really fascinating question. I think it's one of the huge achievements of both Scott and Bulwer's huge critical acclaim as well as mass popularity. Most people don't achieve both. Most people are either or. So to get virtually unanimous critical acclaim as well as lots of people wanting to engage with your novels is quite rare. So I suppose there was still a divide. I guess the other thing I'd say is that it took decades for these novels to be published so that a mass readership could buy them. So if you like, there is a kind of time gap there. So yes, a mass readership did exist, but it didn't exist at the same time as the critics would have got it. If that makes sense. But that's not answering your question, and I don't have a very good answer to your question. I think it's a fascinating one to think about, though.
Well, thank you for trying.
I think I'm going to ask John now.
Stylistically, I might be over-interpreting something you said. You mentioned that obviously we tend to read Austen now and notice irony in a way that perhaps was less detected or
Yes.
Yeah. Is that because that was an unusual kind of modality for a novel? Was she stylistically different in that format of the novel, or is it just a change in reception?
So the question is about whether people missed the irony in Austen in the early days because it was unusual. They weren't expecting to see it in novels.
I think it's probably a bit of both. I mean, to us, it's very blatantly there. To contemporary readers, it wasn't, or it certainly wasn't in her novels. I think it is all about the horizon of expectations and what we tend to expect to see in a novel that we pick up now and that and then, I guess. So that's not. So every reading is always a mix, I suppose, of what you bring to the text and what the text has inherently got in itself, if you like. And so I suppose that it's somewhere in between. So that's a sort of very wishy-washy answer to a very good question.
James G.
He was first, James.
So the commendably short question was, what would be the elevator pitch for republishing Bulwer's work?
It's going to be probably quite boring. Something like, it's not going to be an elevator pitch, but I think what he has taught me is a lot more about understanding Victorian culture. If that is who the Victorians absolutely read all the time, every novel that he published was immediately bought and read. I mean, the Plymouth Professorial Library, for example, bought every new edition as it came out, which must mean that there was demand for each consecutive edition. If that is what they like to read, that tells you a lot about their values. So the heroine of The Last Days of Pompey, for example, is not an Elizabeth Bennet. I can tell you that, and she can't be turned into one either. It's just, so she's very passive, very stereotypical, very obedient. So I suppose that would be my elevator pitch. And he's not as unreadable as people think.
The other James.
In the sociology of text. It's brilliant. I wanted to pick up on the readers, Jane Austen's readers, and in two sort of short, succinct questions. Maybe don't
try it with one.
So the first is about her contemporary readers and whether you can sort of reconstruct the identity of those readers. The second is a little closer to home, and it's when did she become a set text? When did university courses, like kind of thing you teach, suddenly become the thing? Yeah.
So the
readers, and then.
So the first question was about her readers. The second question, and better I say, more interesting question perhaps, is when she became a set text.
So the first question, yes, we do have some records of who her readers were, some partly through comments or through diary entries. Not surprisingly, we're all middle class. A lot of them knew her, but a lot of them, of course, also did not. So there's that diary entry by Walter Scott, for example, in the 1820s that shows that he did know her and really admired her. He, of course, also wrote a review of Emma and so on. So some of those you can reconstruct, but they were very, very much limited to the class that she describes. Set text starts, well, I suppose George Sainsbury in the 1890s publishes an edition where he writes the first scholarly introduction to her work. So I suppose that's probably the point at which I'd argue that is, if you have a scholarly introduction to an author's work, it means you're elevating its value to something that's worthy of analysis, I guess. And then it took, well, the first textual edition, so the first edition that was done with a little bit of care, I guess, if you like, was done by Chapman in the 1920s, and it's really after that it's sort of beyond doubt, I guess, that this is an author who's now part of the canon.
A question from Slido. When a short question, but a big one. When did novels begin to gain popularity?
They were popular all the way through. They just know. So the 19th century is genuinely when novels became more and more popular. in the early 19th century, novels weren't highly regarded, but they were read. So there are lots of records of novels being published and novels being read. Again, there's a nice quotation by Walter Scott where he says novels are often read eaten in secret. So of course, men read novels just as women did. There were lots of people around with lots of money and lots of leisure. So of course they read novels. So novels were, so novels started to be popular, overtaking poetry in the early 19th century, and then continued to just be more and more popular after that.
Gentleman at the front again.
Yeah, the change in perception, I mean, bearing in mind, of course, that there are probably less literate women, but the percentage of literacy men.
Yep.
Yeah. I mean, I do know that between 1960 and 2010, 1960, the most attractive woman never lived was Barbie. But by 2010, the most attractive woman never lived was Laura Croft. I mean, are we still seeing the same trend continuing today? Is that in just 50 years, we've seen a massive movement in terms of what is seen as homemaker Barbie compared to who's out in Laura Croft. If you compare, you've ended up with a sort of heroine who's ahead of the time, haven't you?
So the question is about changing notions of female heroism or female ideals.
Yes, and I think that chimes very much with what it was trying to show, I guess, in that I think it is very much a culture's way of. So Elizabeth Bennet in the 21st century looks very different to Elizabeth Bennet in the late 19th because the culture's view of what it is to be a heroine or to be an ideal woman, I guess, if you like, has shifted.
So we've got time for one more question. Gentleman in the middle.
Roger.
So the question is, how does Austen's reception compare with those of other female writers around about the time, such as Frances Burney?
So Frances Burney was much more popular than Austen at the time. So in the early 19th century, many more people would have known her than had ever heard of Jane Austen. But of course, that was much more short-lived. So I don't think I don't think Fanny Burney. I don't know how many people could name a novel by her. I would go back. Yeah, I know you. Of course you can. David is professor of 18th century literature. If he couldn't name a novel by Frances Burney, something would be seriously wrong. But of course she's now no longer really anywhere close to Jane Austen.
So, ladies and gentlemen, a fascinating evening to the way that things that we take for granted change and taste change. And before we retire outside for something to eat and drink, I think we just join me in thanking Professor Annika Bautz once again.